7 men's stories, exciting entertainment.
The Maid of Orléans, Joan of Arc, and the Call of Destiny imagine France in the 15th century, a land torn apart by the 100 Years' War, ravaged by poverty, destruction, and a seemingly hopeless future. The English occupy vast territories, and the French people yearn for a miracle. Amidst this chaos, a young woman emerges from a small village in Domrémy. Her name is Joan of Arc, a simple peasant girl who claims to have divine visions commanding her to save France and crown its rightful king. Her story is one of the most fascinating and tragic tales in history, a narrative of courage, faith, and an unwavering will that changed the course of a nation's history. A girl's divine visions. Joan of Arc was born in the year 1412 in Domrémy, a small village in the Lorraine region of France. Her life began like that of many other children of her time. She helped her family on the farm, tended to the animals, and learned the traditions of her village. But even as a young girl, Joan was different. At the age of 13, she began to experience visions and hear voices. She claimed that these voices belonged to saints, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, and the Archangel Michael. They instructed her to save France and ensure that Charles VII was crowned as the rightful king. For Joan, these visions and voices were not mere figments of her imagination. She saw them as a divine calling that she could not ignore. Despite her young age and lack of formal education, she was determined to follow this calling. Her conviction was so strong that she set out to meet Charles VII, the Dauphin, who at the time was the claimant to the French throne, though beset by English occupation and internal strife. The journey to the Dauphin. Joan's journey to the royal court was far from easy. She had to overcome deep suspicion and skepticism. After all, she was merely a peasant girl. What could she possibly do? But her determination and unwavering faith in her mission eventually convinced some local nobles to arrange an audience with Charles VII. Charles, desperate for a sign or a miracle that could guide him to save his kingdom, was intrigued by this unusual girl. After she convinced him to let her serve, she was given a small army and dressed in men's clothing, setting out to relieve the besieged city of Orléans. This was a daring decision, as Orléans was considered an impregnable fortress and the heart of the resistance against English occupation. The Siege of Orléans. In May of the year 1429, Joan of Arc stepped onto the battlefield at Orléans. The French troops, who had been fighting the English for months, were exhausted and demoralized. But with Joan at their side, hope returned. She rode at the front of the army, holding the king's banner, and led her men with a determination that inspired and invigorated them. The battle for Orléans was brutal and bloody, but under Joan's leadership, the French achieved the impossible. They drove the English back and liberated the city. This unexpected and astonishing victory made Joan a heroine overnight. She became known as the Maid of Orléans, and her successes gave the French people renewed courage. The Coronation of Charles VII. Following the victory at Orléans, Joan became a key figure in the ongoing war effort. Her next goal was to escort Charles VII to Reims, where he could be crowned as the King of France. Reims was the traditional coronation site of French kings, but it was deep in enemy territory at the time. Yet Joan was undeterred. With newfound determination, she led the French troops to several victories, opening the way to Reims. On the 17th of July, 1429, her vision was fulfilled. Charles VII was crowned in the Grand Cathedral of Reims, with Joan by his side, holding her banner and with tears in her eyes. This was the pinnacle of her mission, the moment for which she had lived. The fall and tragic end. But Joan's triumph was short-lived. After fulfilling her mission, she became increasingly viewed as a threat and a burden by the royal court, who no longer knew what to do with her. In May of 1430, Joan was captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English, during a skirmish. She was handed over to the English and imprisoned in Rouen. There, a terrible show trial was held, accusing her of heresy and witchcraft. The English saw her not only as a threat, but also as an opportunity to humiliate the French king. Despite being subjected to torture, Joan stood firm and never wavered in her belief in her divine mission. However, on the 30th of May, 1431, she was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning at the stake. On that day, Joan of Arc was executed in the marketplace of Rouen. She was only 19 years old, but her courage and conviction made her immortal. She was posthumously exonerated and canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in the year 1920. Today, she is revered as one of France's greatest heroines. The story of Joan of Arc is one of faith, courage, and the unyielding will of a young girl who was willing to sacrifice everything to serve her country. Her actions inspired generations, and her name is forever intertwined with the history of France. Joan of Arc shows us that true greatness often comes from the most unexpected people and places.
Feel free to follow this channel to avoid missing any new content. Disclaimer: the images are AI generated and are for illustration purposes. The stories on this channel are researched to the best of our knowledge.